Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in.
Doing this, especially as a builder or a founder, is incredibly powerful. And the downside is minimal and the upside is infinite almost, because you can take like the journey of being a startup founder or being a builder of any product, and you can engage and co-create with the audience from day one. You don't have to wait 6 months for your product hunt launch when you come out and say, oh, we're building on this, we're building this new thing that was in stealth for 6 months. I believe the new era calls for someone who is authentic from day one and who engages with the audience from day one and brings them on the ride with them.
The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territories, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into the knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odysseys. Joining me this week in The Deep End is Karthik Puvvada, known online and by his friends as KP. KP is the program director for On Deck NoCode and is also known as a leader of the Build in Public movement that has taken the internet by storm. Today's conversation takes place at the intersection of these two movements. When KP thinks about building in public, he encourages his audience to use content as a lighthouse to attract other people to your circle. These content pieces help signal that you're serious about a certain niche and help prevent you from being washed away by the, quote, internet content stream. Stories are how you stand out in a crowded digital world. KP's stories have elevated his NoCode platform. He's excited about how the builders of today don't need coding skills to create tools because they can use drag and drop solutions. We talk about projects in the no-code space that are fresh and exciting, as well as the classics that have real proven staying power. KP's enthusiasm, humility, and charisma all come through during this conversation. It's hard to imagine walking away from this episode and not having fun by building something. He makes you excited to trust the process and just go out there and build. KP, welcome to The Deep End.
Thank you so much, Marshall.
I love a guest like you because you are incredibly true to your build in public vibe / name, very prolific. So it means that you can take quick questions, you're putting out a newsletter, you're putting out a podcast, you're leading the no-code program at On Deck. So we're going to keep rolling with that energy and hit a bunch of different topics in no particular order. Feel free to bounce around with things. So two main things I want to talk about, though. Firstly, just the idea of building in public. And then secondly, no-code tools, which are the thing that you're building in public around the part that you're excited about. So let's just start with building in public. You had a good tweet where you said, most people are still on the fence about building in public, but I'm convinced it's the future. So A, what is building in public? And then we'll get to the other parts of the question after that.
So, everybody has their own definition of this. It's become such a catchphrase now, I'm sure. So everyone has their own take. But if I have to speak from my experience and say, like, how would I define it? How do I think about it? Is really tapping into the power of the creator economy, the internet at this stage where it is right now, the maturity of the internet, Twitter, the social networks and the graphs we have around us, and producing content and using that content as a lighthouse to attract other believers and people who are interested in that kind of content towards your circle. Now, it's a very elongated, like elaborate topic, but I feel that we're at a place where on the internet, you have to stand for something. Otherwise, you're just going to be flooded away, washed away in this river of content and updates, so many feeds. So the way to stand out is by putting yourself, your authentic self, on the internet and anchoring it to something you deeply, deeply believe in, whether that could be crypto, NFTs, no code. Within no code, there's several niches. But like you need that anchor point, and you need to create an abundant amount of content as much as you can tied to that anchor point so that you become top of mind for your customers or your followers or your audience around this topic. And to me, doing this, especially as a builder or a founder, is incredibly powerful. And the downside is minimal and the upside is infinite almost, because you can take like the journey of being a startup founder or being a builder of any product, and you can engage and co-create with the audience from day one. You don't have to wait 6 months for your product hunt launch when you come out and say, oh, we're building on this, we're building this new thing that was in stealth for 6 months. I believe the new era calls for someone who is authentic from day one, who engages with the audience from day one and brings them on the ride with them.
Let me start by giving you a compliment. I record 4 to 5 of these a week. I host 3 different podcasts. That is probably the best opening answer to a pretty basic question I've ever gotten, because I'm taking notes here. You've just gave me, well, actually being very clear, 8 different avenues to go down. So I really mean it. Huge compliments to that.
Thank you. Thank you, man. The problem is I can't shut up. So you have to find a way to ask me to politely shut up on camera, so maybe do a gesture, but
yeah, I'll wave and I'll be more aggressive. No, that was the perfect answer. So let's take that in no particular order. Let's start here. You said tapping into the power of this stage of the internet. What stage of the internet are we in? And what is unique about tweeting in public, making a podcast, releasing a newsletter that wasn't quite true, let's say, in 2009 or 2011?
Great question. So we're at this stage where I would define it, maybe if you're talking crypto terms, I think we're between Web 2 and Web 3, right? And I know you've had a bunch of guests who talked about this as well. Let's talk in non-crypto terms. I think we're at a place where on the internet, there are infinite creators, infinite founders, infinite experts on any given topic. So you take no code, you take healthcare, you take fintech, you take crypto, web, all of this stuff. There's so many people talking about this, and they're all connected through either Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or any kind of social graph. Now, the question then becomes, in an abundant market, think of like brands like, CPG brands that are think of toothpaste. When everybody's producing the same toothpaste or toothbrush, how do you stand out? The way you stand out, the way you cut through the clutter is by stories. And I think even in an abundant market where there's so many ways of so many experts you can follow, so many people you can listen to, there's still a great need for authentic storytelling. And that's one way you can monopolize your tiny niche, in an abundant market where everybody's doing sort of, some sort of what you're already doing. So that's the stage where I think we're in. It also really overlaps with the transformational change we're seeing from trust going from institutions to individuals. So now the new gravity of the center of gravity for trust is individuals, people who are actually practitioners of shit, right? People who are living the life of what they're preaching, as opposed to some guy hiding in the basement, writing a book about a topic and not living it. We don't even know if that person is living or not. And I think we're slowly getting to a point where people have become more skeptical about quote unquote gurus, quote unquote experts who are not showing clearly, through podcasts or tweets or community events, Zoom events, Luma events, what they actually live. How much do they live to live up to what they actually preach? So people are calling out on each other's. They'll call you out much faster now, and so I think it's become an incredible time to be authentic and share your story from day one, including imperfections.
Let's go a little deeper on that then. Are you suggesting, I want to get the order of what you're saying correct, because you're saying that people, as we're seeing this transition, are expecting more public focused parts, and they aren't going to be satisfied by gurus. You don't have to name names because the world is infinitely small, but can you just give an example or of a type of person who in a previous era would have been by themselves? Let's be generous. Let's not say a basement because that's pejorative. Let's say Henry David Thoreau going off to the pond to write and to. We're really stretching my memories from junior year English. I'm not going to follow up what he was writing about, but just that was perceived and seen as a good thing, and that is the type of artistry that people would really sort of want to strive towards, as opposed to the more public-facing version. So if in the context of the setup I just gave you, how should we think about that?
I mean, I think for the longest time, like there was always a sense of like mystery and mystique involved in building products and building startups. I think Steve Jobs kind of pioneered, at least in the tech world we live in, kind of became an anchor point for this, right? Like Apple announces stuff only once a year. So you have to wait until that wee hours, and make a big beeline outside the Apple store to even see what the specs are. Like, God damn it, like you don't even know what the specs are. So of the new iPhone, for example. But I think that kind of influenced a lot of tech culture for the last 20 years, maybe 25 years. And you've seen the rise of building in stealth. Like everybody LinkedIn had starting something new, building in stealth for like 10 years now. Like all my friends from Silicon Valley or SF in California were always like building in stealth. And you had to be part of these internal inside networks. You had to go to that exact kind of Harvard class, this exact kind of clique that you have to be part of to know what the new Henry David Thoreau is working on as the next Medium, for example, or the next Quora. You would never know unless you were part of these internal circles. I think we're at a place where the opposite is now happening, where you actually, because, the world is moving towards transparency. And this is, again, not new. This has been happening for a while. Ryan Hoover, if I would argue, kind of ruined it. He kind of took some things that were happening privately and he kind of involved the larger product and community using like dropping mocks to the next product and version. He would drop InVision mocks, for example, if you know what InVision is, like, or prototyping mocks and say, guys, comment on this. And he started including people in the design process, in the product development process. And I think, so many others did that. I mean, I'm thinking about Peter Levels, who's a great nomad maker, whom some of you may have heard about him. He literally went on Twitch and spent, I think, a weekend and built a startup live and took it to profitability. So people have been like taking a swing at this building in public or building like with an audience for a long time. And I think it hit that inflection point exactly a year ago when COVID happened. And everybody were like, okay, now my geo community doesn't matter. Like, nobody gives a shit on the internet if I'm, friends with 3 other people from Harvard. What matters is proof of work. What matters is what I've done for others. So people like Balaji S, who's been on the podcast, and they've started like evangelizing, proof of work and saying like, your value is tied to your contribution, not based on the exclusive club you're part of or the 4 field friends you know. So my unpopular opinion is that the next Alexis Ohanian, who's building the next Reddit, is among us, within us, watching this podcast, is a community person who's doing this in public. It's not going to be where 6 months we're going to go into a silo to get to a offshore team and build like a fully bloated MVP and then hear from the audience. It'll be, here's like the V1. It looks like crap. What do you guys think? Is it directionally correct? Am I getting there? Am I doing this right? And to a large extent, if you think about like popular examples, I would say Clubhouse was one of my favorite examples who kind of built in public because they had, if you remember, they had town hall sessions. I don't know if they have now, but early on, the way they onboarded a ton of people was by the founders literally hosting rooms where they would talk to you and you could raise a hand and suggest a roadmap ticket item. You can say, oh, can we have a private room? And they would take notes on it. That kind of transparency and direct access to the creator/founder was unheard of in the Reddit 1.0 era and Facebook 1.0 era, right? And I think that's what people are craving now because people want that direct connection to the creators.
It's funny. I was trying to steel man and be a little contrarian and push back on you by saying something like, but the reason why you would want to retreat to Walden's Pond or your basement or wherever you're talking about is Twitter. It's social media. It's so noisy. And how are you going to keep track of everything? But what I'm realizing is all of my assumptions about building in public were based upon this one specific social network. And once again, you're not speaking purely about performing just on Twitter and getting lots of likes, retweets, and followers. So can you just broadly speak to, as a person who also hosts a podcast, how people should conceive of all these building in public spaces? Because what I think I'm realizing here is that you're not suggesting the takeaway from this is that everyone should immediately hop on Twitter and start putting out a thread. There's probably context and different opportunities that people should pursue.
Yeah, and it's fully about reading the room and really like having the intuition and having your own sort of individual thinking, understanding like what makes the most sense for my startup or my product. For example, if I was building the social audio app like Clubhouse, I would 100% host every day some version of an audio room, whether it being on this new thing called Call-In, shout out David Sachs and team, or whether it be on Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces, because my audience at that point of view, in that context, would be audiophiles, people who love audio, people who want to be engaging with others, over audio. So I would probably over-index on audio platforms and like do very little of Twitter or Medium or Quora. But if it's the other way around, like if I'm talking about, for example, with NoCode, like a lot of the NoCode work that I've done was really growing the market. Because a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was not this much hula and like sensationalism about NoCode, right? People were like still warming up to like whether this will still work or, can real companies be built on NoCode? And this 2 months ago, Bubble raised $100 million. Webflow is over $3 billion in valuation. Now it's like a no-brainer, right? But for the longest time, the real work at the time had to be growing the market, which means evangelizing, which means educating, which means sharing your conviction of what's possible with no code with people. And for me, that was through Twitter, because a lot of the builders were like flocking to Twitter. There's a whole indie community in Twitter. There's indiehackers.com on which I was present for a long time. Producthunt.com where I was present a long time. So it's really about reading the room. And so if there's YouTube too, right? Do not underestimate the power of YouTube. I think as we are seeing a whole new rise of what they're calling smart YouTube, Gary Chana's on it, David Perl's been on it, and they're like, people are creating content on YouTube by respecting the audience's intelligence. Back in the day, YouTube was all about like funny dog videos and cat videos, or someone skateboarding their way into a flower shop, and that was funny. That's what I'm talking about. The internet is maturing every week or every day as we speak, and we're at a point where people actually have unbelievable trust on the internet, as opposed to 10 years ago when they were even afraid to put the credit card number onto Amazon.com. Now people are like putting their identity on the internet. People are coming out on the internet. People are putting if you talk about NFTs, they're like signaling to others that I believe in this certain product or a project or a creator by attaching themselves to the PFP, the profile picture on the internet. So internet's like a place where it's almost competing and probably even better than being in the same city with other people. Like it's already crossing the attachment you would have to a certain city, the geo. Where a lot of my friends from the last 2 years have been internet first, Twitter first, YouTube first. So we're crossing that chasm. And I think in 10, 20 years, we'll all be in metaverse. And where you live will be super irrelevant. So I think in that sense, then today is the best time. Actually, the best time was 2 years ago, but today is the second best time to start building in public and putting yourself out there and be a contributor and be a giver over time and build that reputation points,
So let's answer two parts of a question that was raised by the tweet I referenced. What is the typical person's objection or concern about building in public? I would say mine, which feels lame to say out loud, and is probably a signal that I should think a little deeper on this, is it feels cringe. I think of a world where, and it's just basic, it's the basic reason, I think of a world where time for a thread on my new Deep End episode with KP. And here is some vapid point, which is super self-aware. So once again, I'm being a parody, but that's what I fear. I fear people I respect that.
There is a point to that. You may have a point here, right? I mean, there is a section in the building public world where people are taking this. I think it's this clay, and you make what you make out of it. And I think a lot of them are lowballing it. A lot of them are just doing the bare minimum, like going to wikipedia.com and like rewriting that article as thread of the day is like the lowest and the dumbest ROI for your time and even audience's time. So that, of course, is there. It's always there in any new market, in any new trend. I remember watching and following and tracking a ton of NoCode products in the early days, and everything was a job board. And I'm like, oh my God, job board's like 101, y'all. But everything was a job board. And now, Palette kind of like took over that. And it's like the easiest way, if you know Palette.xyz, easiest way to create a job board. And like suddenly now nobody's building a job board. So there will always be people who will do the bare minimum and create that kind of feeling in your mouth. I'm like, that taste in your mouth. But it's also a question of noise, separating noise from signal. From my vantage point, I think if you live sort of in my shoes for about a week or two, I think I've gotten good enough and retained my sense of optimism and a sense of wonder that I haven't gotten over to the jaded side to look at the threads and say, okay, that's lame. It is lame, but I think that it's like a coach looking at a kid swinging a first baseball game, and you're like, yeah, we got work to do here, but maybe let's go fix some other. Let's go fixate on some other builders who are doing incredible work there. So did you ask for downside, right? The downside is, of course, in the beginning, it looks like cringe. The other thing too is downside. The one misconception people have, Marshall, is that people think building in public equals, let me just air my dirty laundry in public.
I've seen what you're referring to, and I have so many images in my head. It's very funny.
Let me just talk about the bad date that I had with this guy who works in tech. I'm like, nobody gives a crap. I mean, it's not gaining any reputational points / contribution points / and so if you remember Packy's, the article on the great online game, like that's just a side character just wasting their, CPU power on like dumb shit that doesn't matter. You have to advance the narrative of humanity. You have this one shot, one life, one opportunity where our ancestors would die. Like my ancestor literally, I came from India, grew up in India, would die to have the 24,000 people that I have on Twitter following me with the podcast that I have to go put their word across the world. If it's a word of optimism, if it's a word of helping each other out, if it's a word of advancing humanity through tech, they would have loved that chance. And they didn't have it because of telecom. We didn't have telecom when I was growing up. And because of internet, we didn't have internet. And now we have it. And all you do is go pick out a Wikipedia article, like, get the heck out of here, right? So I'm like, that's the bare minimum. And the other thing is a lot of people do, like I said earlier, is they think that, okay, building in public is just like shaming others in public or dirty, like airing my dirty laundry in public. That's also not it. It's just, to me, it's worse than cringe. Cringe I can tolerate, I can just pass. But this slam dunking on somebody else because it can attract some negative attention is like, to me, like the most meaningless work. To me, the misconception there is that people think that building in public is absolute. They're like extremists. They're like, absolutely, we have to share every single detail. You don't have to. Nobody asks you to. My wife has an interesting term called TMUD, and it stands for too much unnecessary detail. And says, if your content passes that bar, like, is this too much unnecessary detail about a topic that is not relevant or it's not helping anybody, it's not inspiring anybody, you probably shouldn't tweet about it. Leave it in your draft. So maybe make it an internal Slack thing, right? But if the way I look at the content that shines to me does one of three things. It either teaches somebody something specific that they can use in their life or personal life or professional life, or it inspires someone who is who's just down sad, or they're feeling like it's not for them, right? And I believe me, there's millions of them. There are millions of people who are one spark away, and that's something that drives me, Marshall. Is that the reason I wake up in the morning and then put on my sweat? I'm not really wearing much, fancy stuff anyway. what inspires me is knowing that sometimes it takes one conversation to ignite a spark on someone who has an epic amount of latent potential. And I was that person 3-4 years ago. And so the people who I admired at the time did exactly the same thing that I tried to do in a very botchy, imperfect way. But they just did the same thing, which is they just told me that they believed in me, that it's possible for a guy who looks like me to make it in Silicon Valley, to make it to be whatever they want, to dream whatever you want and go after it. And don't worry about societal expectations of you. Because let me tell you, societal expectations for someone like me were like a village kid, like nothing more. So I think the kind that inspires me is the one that teaches you, the one that inspires somebody else, or one that you want to document it and reflect in public so that you can get back to it and refer to it at one point in the future. Like stuff that actually, it's a milestone in your life. Like something like, for example, I frequently write tweets about, like I wrote a whole thread about joining On Deck. It's a milestone in my career. I came from this corporate background, always was the underdog. And I thought Eric and David took a wild shot on me. So it was a meaningful moment for me to document it. And I did. So yeah, you gotta separate this signal from the noise. And that's half the battle.
The people who are listening to this on a podcast versus a video will not see the disappointment in my face, because towards the start of what you were just saying, I actually thought you were about to start rapping Lose Yourself by Eminem. You said one shot, other statement, one opportunity. I actually thought you were going to do it. So it's a real disappointment that you didn't really take the opportunity to do that there. But God, speaking of cringe, that would have been really, really bad on a couple different levels. Okay, so this is actually really great. So before we get to the last bit about NoCode here, I wanna push on something you said that's really, really interesting, and is actually helpful in helping me think about this a little better, which is that you just said at the start that you have to believe in something. Because I don't know if you saw this, but Sarah Fisher, who's a great reporter at Axios, just did a good, quick piece about how for a lot of people, there's this perception that the creator economy isn't reaching its natural conclusion because it's finding that, unsurprisingly, like the top 1% of podcasters, of newsletter writers, et cetera, are actually generating most of the revenue. And this dreamed of creator middle class isn't arriving so far. And the general advice that people take when they're looking at the creator space is, hey, find a niche and build and produce in that niche. But I think when you add the point you just made about believing in something, you actually take that advice to find a niche and take it in a really useful direction, because I think you see this too. We see so many people who see the build a niche advice and just they say, okay, I'm local news guy, or I'm X, Y, or Z person. But because there's not really something there, that doesn't take you to where you actually have to be in those higher percentages. So I would just love for you to talk about the believing aspect, because it also speaks to the point you're making, which is that you are asking people to be substantive. The takeaway here, once again, is not that you should go on Wikipedia and pump up your Twitter following, because guess what? That would work short term, but to what we are trying to do here, it wouldn't work.
Game recognizes game. Like you could be balling and you could have some kind of inflated, football and just make do in your local league. But when you reach the NFL, people will see through you, right? Like the coaches will see through you, audience will see through you. So when you reach at some point after this, Wikipedia cringe act, you will be called out. You will run into someone who you admire, who will look at you straight in the eye and say, what the hell were you doing the last 6 years or 6 months, And so I think to me, those are the people who lack ambition, who are playing short-term games. The truly ambitious are the ones who have infinite patience. And this is a quote that I read from one of the books I was reading. It really was a misnomer, but it hit me really hard. It said, if you want some incredible results or something, you need to have infinite patience. And I like that phrase because we look at patience as a limited capacity. It's like you think of it like gas in the car. And you're like, yeah, you only have a certain amount of certain gallons. But if you reach deeper and if you go to your why, we all have infinite patience. Nobody has a scorecard. Nobody is like asking you, running behind you and saying, oh, you got to get to these number of followers by this month. And this, it's all made up. It's like what Thor says in Avengers. Everything is made up. Have fun with it. Who cares if you hit your goal in like that? That's why it's like a lot of people are so upset when they come to me in DMs and KP, I couldn't hit my 3K followers goal in 4. I'm like, who made this goal? I'm like, myself, I'm like, why? Life is already hard. You're probably caring for a family member. You're probably helping somebody else already. Why do you need this extra pressure and then feel disappointed as opposed to just have fun with it? I built my entire following just by having fun with it. I mean it. And I did it intentionally. I knew how to play the game, how to read the room, how to like write in certain formats so that people can actually consume better and digest faster. So I knew the tactics. But the mindset has always been, it's about fun and value. If you can flip that coin as many times as you can, like it's about fun for you, intrinsic motivation, value to others, that's extrinsic motivation. Now, it depends on what other people find valuable. That's why you can't simply be the local news girl or, like a pet zoo girl or pet zoo boy. It doesn't work because there are not enough people looking for pet zoo content. But there are millions of people looking for no-code content, for example, or they're looking for NFT content, looking for podcast content. There's infinite niches that are still open, but they're not being occupied, not being dominated, not being entered because people are underestimating the power of the internet. That's it. Like people think that, if I'm this, niche about, if I'm this person who likes fintech. The other thing I also think about, Marshall, is a niche is something you carve out of the longer narrative about tech or your career. So you can carve out the piece that you find interesting. So when I started out by going on producthunt.com a lot, and I was working in product teams at Delta and NBA.com and stuff. So I always had the product angle, product manager angle. But then I liked interacting with community and sharing with thoughts with them and then really like jiving and jamming with them. So I kind of combined these two and became product and community person. But that's such a boring combo and the world didn't need another guy. They didn't have that much of a desire, I guess. So I didn't really stick. So I switched up and I became community and no-code person. That blew up. And this is, again, the timing of that was so accurate that no-code was taking off 2018. And so I built a ton of no-code projects, and I also did a lot of Zoom shows. I did no-code camp. I did office hours. I did a 2,000 person community called Kappa in no-code. So no-code and community worked for me. So the combo worked for me as a niche. Blew up, got the job, landed the job at On Deck, and now I'm slowly doing the community and building public combo. So there's no right answer. Even to me, like I feel like a lot of people look to me and say like, you found your niche, KP, or you've had it easy. I'm like, I don't know, I have the answers. Then sorry to disappoint you. I think I kind of know some things, but also I want to evolve. So that's where I'm constantly. You're always discovering where you fit better to serve the world best, and that should be the niche you should work on.
So let's talk in our last bit here before we get to the audience about what you actually believe in, which is no code. We keep referencing no code and how we're in this really interesting space relative to 2 years ago. I would love just to feel free to go as long as you want on this one, because it's really important. Just why are you excited about no code? Why is it another space where people should be quite literally building in?
So I think no code is today where code was like maybe 25, 30 years ago in especially in software applications. And the reason I say that is because it's so early and people think it's like saturated, it's late. I think it's so early and we have to grow the market because the market, there's like a ton of people who could be incredible no coders, but they don't know it. It's the same thing with creator economy, right? There's a ton of people who would crush it if they just decided to turn their camera on and do a podcast, or if they, did like other things that are useful, but they just don't know it. So no code is in the same space. If you just look at the stats, there were, I think 0.3 or 0.4% worldwide professionals are developers. So that leaves like a huge ton, 99% or more, of people who are not developers and they're still professionals. Now, these professionals back in the day had to just wait. If they have an idea, they had to wait on the developers to take action. Or if they, let's say, had an improvement or an internal tool they wanted to build to improve their conversion on certain funnels, for example, if you're marketing, they had to wait on the developers, or they had to go buy a very expensive, bloated, tool like HubSpot or Salesforce, which is an overkill for so many of like one-off interesting use cases you want to just test out. Now, I believe that entire demographic is going to tap into and leverage NoCode in the next 10 years. And they're maybe like we're at the 1%, 2% mark right now. And we're seeing a lot of them coming into ODNC, the On-Deck NoCode Fellowship I run.
What's, sorry to interrupt, though you gave me permission. What's the demographic you're talking about?
So the people who are working at companies, who are professionals, who are in marketing, who are in sales, who are in HR, who are in ops, and they all have some version of spreadsheet they track. They have some version of an internal list of things that they do for their job. There is some version of wiki they build for their job. It's usually in Google Docs or Notion. Now, all of these people have the potential to become no-code builders and build solutions and tools that will help their teams. Maybe they don't need to be an app store. Maybe that's okay. But they can build and improve and gain productivity, have productivity gains by building with no-code tools. Because then they have a more seamless, integrated, well-structured process or an application, as opposed to a janky like mishmash of or hackshift thing that they're doing today, right? So in my view, every division or a function within a business, sales, marketing, HR, ops, legal, finance, is going to be disrupted or is going to be reimagined with the no-code tools today. And
it's funny. I just realized it's either that I'm a terrible podcast host or people like you have accomplished your goal, because I don't think we ever actually even got you to define what a no-code tool was. Because that's the perfect example of how much the space has changed. Yeah. Because if we'd done this podcast 3 years ago, I said, so what is no code? So we just took that as a given, but we've got a diverse audience. So can we just get your definition of no code?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the way I look at no code is essentially building software, tools, applications, in some cases, real apps that go on App Store, but generally building software, web apps, progressive web apps, without having to go into syntax and writing system level code. Now, for a long time, this was only possible for developers, people who understood the ins and outs of how to install a server, how to make sure that my system's always running, like how to have like backups and shit. But with AWS, you don't need to do all of this. Like the no-code tools today, like if you think about Webflow, think about Bubble, think about Adalo, think about Glide, they're all coming in with like, server runtimes. They're coming in with everything in a box set up, like plug and play. All you still have to do is think about what you want this particular software to do. So kind of like give it like some logical flow, like user starts here, opens a document, writes this data, saves it in a database, and then logs in, logs out. But even those functions are being modularized. And people are doing these things called packs, like Coda is another no-code example, and where you don't have to go write the sign in, sign off, log off, log in modules, where somebody else, will write that module and make it a template, and you can just inherit that into your project. So this was, again, a recent development. We saw, because again, 10 years ago, there was no Figma. There was no collaboration on the cloud or on the browser. Now, because there's collaboration on the browser, I can edit something here and Marshall can see, my edits in the Notion document. And the same thing applies to no-code tools. I can create a Kanban board, or I can create like a user login, and you can see from that side that KB created a new entry in the user login. So this is no code to me, right? And because this has become such a drag and drop, point and click, everything and anything except writing actual syntax, now this opens up a whole plethora of personalities and demographics who can now manipulate this and leverage this, right? Because it was only developers who could get into, this depth. But now someone could spend 3 hours and they could be a decent no-coder. I wouldn't say it's mastery, but that's where we, like communities like ODNC come in play, or there's so many other platforms outside where if you can get a sample of all these other tools to enough so that you can actually make them actionable and use them, apply them in your daily life, in your daily, professional life, the gains are immense, in my view.
For my last question before I throw it to producer Jackson to direct the Q&A, you're hosting a great podcast about building in public. You've got some great episodes, good ones coming up that we'll actually share on this feed. Can you just talk a little bit about that experience? Because the current discussion we've had is very Twitter focused. In these last, few minutes, just what are your lessons from building on a format where it is incredibly difficult to share things? Say what you want about YouTube, say what you want about Twitter. It is possible when you have 200 followers or 50 people who subscribe to your YouTube account to create some content that for whatever reason just blows up and goes somewhere. That is just not possible with podcasting. So I'm just curious how you think about growth in that context.
I just have immense respect for podcasters after I started one. I just thought, I really took it for granted for a long while as a consumer. As I was driving, I would listen to podcasts. I was always a big fan of podcasts. I was, when I had commute and all that stuff, and I was like, yeah, it's easy. Just buy a couple mics and set it up and ask a few questions. Actually, turns out, as you can relate, Marshall, it's freaking hard, and there's no viral hack. Even an all-star guest cannot move the needle of your growth if you don't have intentionality, and if you don't have cadence, and if you don't have just the appetite, and like I said, the curiosity, and earlier on, if you don't play it for the fun part of it, there's no way you can make it more than 10 episodes. One of my friends recently tweeted about this and said, KP, I think I was at second or third episode and I gave up. This is not for me. This is like moving the feedback loop is insanely slow, because think about the number of people who would listen to a podcast and go into App Store and leave a review or DM you about what they heard. They usually listen, they digest, internalize something, and they move on. So literally you have no clue how many people are listening to you, what part they're listening to, and all that. And so after 2 or 3 episodes, I almost gave up. And then somehow one Sunday, I had this courage that I was like, wait, let me actually, the thing that I really am good at is Twitter and writing content and writing short form tweets and building in public. So why don't I recruit my future guests in public? And of course, the only downside is I'll have to face some rejection in public. But I was like, I've seen worse. I've had worse. This is like thick skin moment. It's a learning moment, opportunity to do something that's a little discomforting, but maybe the upside will be amazing, which turned out the next guest was Gary Vee, and it was 25 minutes he said he was in, and it was a shoot my shot moment. And I've used that multiple times to land other guests too. And I think it's a great format. The lessons are, to me, that the host has to be insanely present and curious about genuinely extracting perspectives and wisdom and experiences of the guest, and has to do it for fun. There's really no shortcut. And so I admire you, by the way. And I'm like, I don't know how.
As I'm looking at my phone and just sort of yeah.
No, I mean, I think, again, this too, right? It's just, there's no hacks. You can try all you want to get maybe you do threads, you do all this other content stuff, but it is a game of sheer endurance.
Patience, to your earlier point.
Infinite patience. So, and in fact, for that specific reason, I want to go 500 episodes like Eric Thornburg. So I actually asked Eric, and I know we were talking about Eric, who's the founder of On Deck, and some of the audience might know him. One day I cornered him in New York, and I asked him, how the hell do you do what you do, for what 500 episodes? And then he just said, Kippy, there's 2 ways to do this. One, you could do it because it's an obligation, you want to show off, you want to impress the audience, et cetera, or you can just do it like the greats have always done it, like Charlie Rose and so on, personally as a learning tool and to build relationships with others. I thought I fell in that camp too, and so I gave up on trying to make it all splashy. It's bare minimum, and I'm there with the guest, and I do it.
That's awesome. Jackson, please come in on that note with Q&A direction.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall, and thanks, KP. So, you talk about how build in public is this new trend that might actually be supplanting stealth mode that might have been the mode of the past. But part of why stealth mode works is because if you have a good idea, you don't necessarily want it to be stolen. So how can you build in public and reap those benefits if you're worried that your idea might be stolen by someone else who maybe has a larger following or some other advantage that you don't have?
I think also to another point I have on that is the fact that even that people trying to steal ideas is also archaic. It's over. That was all when the entire ideation market belonged to 4 zip codes in Silicon Valley or in California. Now we're living in this abundant universe. Like we're living in this abundant world. Like the next big Airbnb is coming from Utah. The next big Calendly is coming from Atlanta. Nobody gives a shit where your zip code is. So the 0 to 1 ideas, so like when you wish to have an idea, when you share it with somebody else, you don't want it to go, go out and somebody else to steal it. That kind of limited thinking is gone. You have to almost, like a lot of founders come to me and say like, "Okay, I don't want to share this." I'm like, that's gone. It's over. The moment you say something about an idea on Twitter or any of the podcasts, somebody will, it's almost a given that today some no-coder out there is cloning On Deck, is cloning this podcast, is cloning everything we do. And you can't stop it. So my answer is, it's become this abundant market, like how if you think about CPGs and brands, like Nike can't stop somebody from making Adidas, or somebody, Adidas and Nike can't stop the next DTC brand. It's always been possible in especially CPG worlds and like the public brands worlds where there's no way you can stop except you tell better stories and you build better communities. But for somehow in tech, people early on for 10 years, they had this honeymoon period where they were like, oh, if I can come up with Uber, nobody could stop me. But what happened? Lyft came around. Lyft did a pretty good job too. So today, that's like 10x. So there will be 10x attempts. When Clubhouse came out, I remember last year, there were 14 or 15 other social audio drop-in apps. Rest in peace, many of them went dead like in 3 months. So it's inevitable that somebody will copy or clone or attempt to do something like that. So to me, the answer is be prepared for it. And instead, super index, double, triple index on community.
So I'll read this question from the chat. Keep them coming, people. This is from PW. What is a new no-code tool that excites you the most?
Oh, that's a good question. There's so many new ones. I'll say the newest one that I recently came across and I've been playing with it is called the.com. And it's a cop-out answer because I was partly fascinated by the domain, but how the hell did they get the domain? So the.com is coming into the market. It's fairly new, coming into the market. It's similar to Webflow. So check it out. I actually have anyway, so that's my answer, the.com.
Let me just add a question to that. What is because PW's question said new, what's just something that's an old mainstay of your space that you're still excited about?
Interesting. So what's been around for a long time that I'm still excited about?
Yeah, that you're still just excited about. You're like, hey, I thought this was great in 2018. It's still great now. Everyone should keep track of it.
I think it's been amazing to watch Bubble to have an endurance effect. Bubble's been around for a long time. They've been bootstrapping for about 7-8 years. And they suddenly just turned into rocket ship mode and they raised $100 million like a month ago. And now they're like truly going after it. But I remember early days, Bubble was a bit clunky. The interface was not forgiving, and it was really hard to get on and build something with it. And I remember trying something, and I eventually got to it, but I was not that bullish in 2018. And now looking at all the improvements and all the changes and all the community they built up, I still use it and I love it, and I think it's here to stay.
Next question is from Josh. Do you think intellectual property protection laws should be updated for a build in public world?
I can't say for all the IP laws, but definitely for software. I think the thing with software, Josh, is it's so easy to clone, right? It's so easy to copy. Like I can create a HubSpot-like CRM in a weekend, and people have done it. People have created like Twitter clones using NoCode. Twitter clones. Twitter is actually a pretty sophisticated, stuff. I mean, so I think with the rise of no-coders, there's thousands of no-coders every day learning new tools, learning how to build SaaS. There's thousands of developers going to boot camps, Career Karma, shout out Ruben. I mean, you can't stop it. It's inevitable that somebody will attempt. I don't think they'll succeed. That depends on your execution, your community, your moat, and your distribution advantages. But some people will attempt to replicate what you're doing. And especially in big tech, this is happening all around. Like somebody started Instagram stories, right? Was it like Snapchat that started stories? And next week, Instagram ripped them off. And then so did Facebook. And so it's a question of feature parity. We live in this abundant feature parity world where everyone's going to, be sort of doing the same thing. And so, I mean, in software, I think IP laws are very hard to enact, but maybe in hardware, biotech, longevity and all that stuff for sure.
Next question is from Greg Z. For those who struggle to get into the creative mindset for build and public posts, do you have any tips for making it a natural part of your workflow? That's a really good question.
That's a really good question. A lot of it has to do with sort of installing the right habits. And to me, the source of the intention and the motivation to install right habits comes from identity. So you have to really believe that you're the kind of person who wants to share and include other people in your journey and co-create with your audience, even if that audience means 7 people. That's the part. When Gary Vee used to say this, I used to be offended. He used to say, like, reply to the 8 people who follow you. And I'm like, what the hell, Gary? Come on. It's easy for you, man. But it is the truth, and that's where our ego gets in the way and it kind of blocks us from serving and helping the 7 or 8 who follow us. I remember a specific tweet that I constantly retweet, which is me saying thank you and being grateful to 414 followers on Twitter. And I keep retweeting that every time I hit a 1K, new K, 20K, 30K, because I'm like, that's exactly the answer. You're really understanding that it's not numbers, it's actually people, and waking up and believing that, oh, you know what, today I'm going to help these 7 people and they'll tell their 5 other friends. So that's 35 people right there, So, I mean, Sahil Lavingia has a fantastic tweet, and and he shared this on one of our podcasts or events. He said the first 10,000 people that he had attracted, like the first 10,000 followers, he said he had almost like 8,000 coffees with them. He literally met every single person in SF. And he said, that's how I did it. And now it feels like you look back and you're like, wow, so I was like almost a huge audience, I don't know, 200K followers. And you're like, but that came from doing things that don't scale. So my tips are identity, believing that you're the kind of person that you does these kind of things, and then putting in good habits of like replying to other people's good tweets or creating the hardest part though is going from consumer. So I had three transformations. I was a full-on consumer lurker. Like I was like consuming content, reading, feeling cringe about shit, but never did anything. From there, I became a curator where I started developing taste and started curating my feed, following, unfollowing, and then writing my commentary on some good threads or good tweets and like quoting. I don't know how many times I quoted Eric Thornburg and Gary Vee and then Balaji S in the early days. And then from there, I became a creator. That was the hardest leap because there's literally like, it's like, Marshall can agree. I'm sure Jackson can agree. Like in the early days of being a creator, like it feels like you're speaking in the void. Like, you literally have no feedback loops, but you have
2 likes. Nothing is worse than putting out that tweet and 2 likes and they're pity. Right. And they're pity likes too, right? It's they're like, I do these occasionally. You're just like, man, it's been like an hour and I'm just going to throw a like on that regardless of its quality.
And so I guess, it's again, a short-term thing. I keep reassuring a lot of the early stage builders and makers in public. Like, remember, it's a short-term thing. Like, once you hit that, whatever inflection point that is, threshold, 10K, maybe 5K, depending on your niche. Like, now I look back and like the number of tweets that I do without thinking about it are so high. And I look back, I'm like, I can't believe that went viral. It's like, it's always like the dumbest thing that goes viral. And you're like, what? So it'll get better over time. You don't have to try that hard, but in the early days, you just have to try hard.
KP, I've got another question for you, bringing us back towards the top of the episode. I hear what you say about the value building in public for founders, especially like if I'm in the audio space, then it makes sense for me to be in a Clubhouse room or in a Twitter space regularly because that's like where my niche is. But what if I am this builder, founder, pioneer in spirit, but I haven't identified that niche yet. I'm a jack of all trades or Jackson of all trades, to pardon the pun. Like, how would one build in public without knowing their destination yet?
Right. I mean, that is a little tricky, right? When you don't know where you're going, how do you invite an audience to follow you, right? Because you're like going all over the place, going all the places. But maybe then the answer is going a little meta and becoming the person who is a learner, who's curious about new things and who's going to like share. I think we're overemphasizing on the niche here, in this case, Jackson, in this conversation, and underemphasizing on sharing and producing and creating. The hard part, I believe me, trust me, it's not figuring out what the niche is. The hard part is, can you be a relentless, prolific shipper? Once you become that, then it's like adjusting a little bit of your form and shape and technique, for example, right? Like, you have to be an athlete first, then I can make you a tennis person. And people always assume the other way around. They're like, what sport should I pick? And you're like, I don't know. It depends on so many factors. What are you naturally good at? What do you enjoy doing? So the answer there is just, be the person who is about sharing. Be the person who is about, if you see Anne-Laure Lecomte is an example, one of the people that I follow. She runs Nest Labs, but she's very curious. And Steph Smith is an example. I don't know if you guys have invited Steph, but she works at The Hustle, and Steph does a lot of interesting, disparate, unique things. And then Jack Butcher is an example. He does so many different things. And so I think it's about sharing and creating, with your audience and sharing the journey with them, and less about like having all the answers.
So for my last quick question here, you use the word community a lot. And as a podcaster, I'm hyper aware of narratives and words that people use. You've clearly convinced me and the people who follow you that when you use these terms, you're not using them superficially. But I'm just noticing there can't be this many people who understand community relative to how much they talk about it, is a good way to put it. So what do you think differentiates the Twitter vibey aesthetic version of community, the idea of community, from an actual community?
It's a matter of displaying how much you care about others. And a true community member / contributor will suffocate when he or she meets real people with real needs, and when they're being authentic, if you're not being authentic. So people can see through that. And that's why a lot of people are frustrated, because they understand community as a narrative, as a catchphrase, as a thing. And then they go on this, 10 people Zoom, 4 people Zoom, 1 person Zoom, or like in live IRL event, and they're like absolutely disappointed, or they're like, oh my God, I just can't be this community person, because they're looking for something superficial, flashy to add to the narrative of what they're building, and the larger narrative they're building on the internet. It's really no such thing. You genuinely have to be happy and content with helping others, serving others, knowing that full well that this will probably not be returned or reciprocated, but you're doing it because that's who you are. And the number of times like people like DM me today about something I said 2019 December about them in DMs, and they're like, that changed my life, or that helped me get a job. That helped. Blows my mind. Because in my head, when I did it, I really didn't think it was going to matter that much. Shout out Nico, who just sent me a beautiful DM yesterday. Nico Zono, who's joining on deck, by the way, Marshall. He sent me a long ass DM yesterday on Slack. And he's like, KP, like, you got to know this. I'm like, he was one of 115 people I talked to at ODNC2. And I'm sorry, Nico, but I don't actually remember what I said to you. But he reminded me what I said to him. I was like, wow. And so my answer to this is like, Marshall, it's insanely hard to build community if you don't appreciate the sacrifice and the service part of it. It's insanely easy. I'm sure Eric will agree, and a lot of us at On Deck will agree, and you know this personally too. If you approach it from a perspective of it's about service, it's about others, less about me. It'll come back to me. Karma has a funny way to reaching back to you, but it's just literally about others. And then you can take this online persona you built up, and real life doesn't disappoint you. Otherwise, it's going to be a hell of a journey if you're trying to fake it.
That is the perfect place to end things. So would love for you, KP, to shout out the podcast, your newsletter, anything that listeners should be checking out.
The first and foremost thing I'll shout out is something that's so dear to me, something I worked so hard on, is the On Deck NoCode Fellowship. So folks, if you're interested, if you're on the fence, if you're anywhere in this NoCode journey and you want to know more, find other 150 people, 115 to 120 people to jive with, jam like this for the next 8 weeks, go to odnc.io or go to beyonddeck.com, and you'll find NoCode there, and please apply. We're currently taking applications. Now, apart from that, as my creator life, as Marshall has pointed to earlier, I do a lot of experiments, and one of them is the Build in Public podcast. Website's buildinpublicpodcast.com. My newsletter is buildinpublic.xyz. And on Twitter, I am at thisiskp_.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.